Okay, maybe I'll get started with just a little bit of housekeeping while a few more people trickle in. So thank you very much for those of you that have joined us. This is our 4th KBA webinar in a series that we've been running through the fall and winter. So thank you. If you are interested in past webinars that we have recordings available for all of those, and we'll be recording this one as well. I can put a link in the chat box in a moment. We are aiming to continue doing these webinars on a somewhat monthly basis for the next couple months at least, so stay tuned for those on our Twitter account and on our e-newsletter if you receive that. I can also put a link to sign up for that in the chat box. So before we get started, I'll just say that we are going to hold all of the questions until the end, and we encourage you to please put your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and we can hopefully dive into most or all of those at the end. We have had a couple issues in the past with some of our webinars where people have been unable to access the chat box, and so we'll also at the end take an opportunity to allow people to unmute if they would prefer ask their questions verbally. Okay, so with that, I will introduce our speaker today. Originally, the plan for this webinar series was to have co-presenters, including Roger Lewis, who is from the Nova Scotia Museum. Unfortunately, Roger is unable to join us today, but we still have Dr. Jeff Wall, who will be giving the entire presentation today. Jeff is a postdoctoral fellow with the WCS Canada and the University of Guelph. He's also working with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And today Jeff's going to be talking to us about envisioning compatibilities between the Mi'kmaq environmental values and KBA criteria Mi'kma'ki. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Kiara, for your organization. It's wonderful to be with you all, and thank you all for being out there. It's a very interesting format. My first seminar on this approach. But I'd like to say first Skano, which is Kayohono, or what we call Cayuga people's term for hello and welcome. I'm speaking to you from Ithaca, New York, in the Finger Lakes region. And like Jamie said, I'm a postdoc at WCS Guelph, WCS Canada, and Guelph University, where I'm also participate in the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. My partner in this project that I'll be discussing with you today is Roger Lewis, and I'm quite sad he can't make it, especially considering the tragic circumstances which prevented him from being here. And I will attempt to faithfully present his ideas, and especially the spirit of our conversation that we've been holding over the last few months on this topic you see in front of you. Before I brush past that feeling of sadness, I wanted to remind myself and the audience that Roger's very personal story of his life and very personal story of his career is a quintessential reason that we've been in such great dialogue together. He tells the story like this. He's a very accomplished archaeologist in the territory of Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kma'ki. He one day walked out of an archaeological collection and realized he had to pinch himself to decide, am I still here? Am I still alive? And that ethic of wanting to know that the way of life of the Mi'kmaq people lived on in himself and in his community and in his environment is really what brought us together. We'll discuss more of the details about that for sure. But it brings me to this takeaway message before I run through the title. I'll take this moment to give you the takeaway message from this talk, which is that to move forward together in environmental collaboration programs without feelings and the personal experience being front and center would be as unimaginable to us, many of us scientists, as if we were asked to move forward with such programs without being able to use mathematics or many of our essential tools of our worldview. So what I'd like to say front and center is that some of the argument I'll be presenting today is that Indigenous peoples' participation in scientific environmental programs is almost always motivated by their drive to survive culturally, like Roger Lewis, pinching himself, reminding themselves that they belong today and are very active today and are very influential today in the contemporary world. So with that, I'll walk through this title, explain some of the key terms that are really important. One, is the term Mi'kma'ki and the term Mi'kmaq. They're related, of course, linguistically, because in Mi'kmaq self-concept, Mi'kma'ki is an essential aspect. The territory, most of which we'll be discussing, includes Nova Scotia, but it is also in Cape Breton, parts of northern Maine of the United States, and also part of Newfoundland. When I say that, I'm speaking to Roger Lewis's essential view that cultural memory exists in language, and language is thus an essential resource for remembering. I'd like to also mention that when I speak of values in this title, I'll be speaking of these softer issues like feelings and meaning, along with ecological metrics, and bringing them into a discussion together. So when I say values, I'm spanning a wide breadth, and I hope to show you that it's important work. Finally, the first word in the title, envisioning, speaks to the expectations I have for this talk, in which I will get down to some concrete outputs that we're working on, but generally, Roger and I are still at the stage of envisioning. And as I'll explain about the Conservation and Reconciliation Partnership, it's a long process. So with that, let's see if I can move forward.
Oh, it looks like we have lost Jeff. We'll just give him a moment to reconnect.
Jamie, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, welcome back, Jeff.
Excuse me. Okay, so roadmap for today's talk will be roughly in thirds. I'll give a rough third to the background of this program and to the major models of Indigenous-led conservation. I'll be talking about the framework that we hope to introduce and implement, whereby the implementation of the KBA program will be especially meaningful in the context of Mi'kmaq. And also this tool could be used elsewhere.
Jeff,
Finally,
can you reshare your screen?
oh yeah.
Thank you.
Any luck?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, thank you. Finally, I'll be walking through some of the early trial of this framework and this instrument in Mi'kmaq, or Mi'kmaq. So to describe the context in which the KBA is being born into, or the KBA program, and just before I define it, I'll just point out that I think the broad strokes of its reality are the following. We have an era that is geologic and is being defined by humankind, and there's broad consensus on this point. Where scientists, to my understanding, differ on this is how to mark it and delineate it as the geologic era of the humankind, or Homo sapiens. One of the key candidates is species loss, or what's sometimes termed the sixth mass extinction. In my mind, when we bring these two concepts together, we acknowledge that humankind is such a defining force on the planet that it's causing massive species loss. We also acknowledge that humankind, or Homo sapiens, is in a critical role of conserving or preserving species numbers and other aspects of environmental well-being, environmental balance. This meets with a moment, specifically in Canadian history, where the term and the concept and the incredible program is being proposed of reconciliation. I'll define it by its own words in the Indigenous, the Truth and Reconciliation Report, which calls for Canada to come to terms with the events of the past in a manner that overcomes conflict and establishes a respectful and healthy relationship going forward. I consider it an especially good model in Canada. But there are some challenges with programs like the KBA and other environmental conservation programs in the Conservation and Reconciliation, Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership, which I'll just call CRP, hopefully from now on. There's a strong ethic that reconciliation in any aspect of life, including environmental conservation, will require deep internal changes and adaptations on the part of settlers and on the part of First Peoples to move forward. In the case of the KBA, we have a program which, by its own terms, is identifying sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. And the global standard for the identification of these areas sets out globally agreed criteria for the identification of KBAs worldwide. This is clearly a globally framed program, essential and in a sense of humankind and Homo sapiens. And yet it will meet with some translational challenges if you are, let's say, the Mi'kmaq, who believe that you sprouted from this specific territory and can hardly imagine existence outside of it, although that's a very interesting area to explore as well. So the models for bringing these streams together are out there, many of them really active in Canada. The Indigenous Guardians Program, for instance, is active in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and lesser so in the United States, is a community-based environmental steward program for people who practice their cultural and traditional teachings on the land. Similarly, the IPCA program, or what are known as Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, are also moving forward and being proposed around the world in many different forms, and are identified by being, one, sacred and significant to Indigenous peoples or Native peoples, in which Indigenous peoples have significant influence in terms of governance, and in which environmental goals and objectives are being sought and achieved. Similarly, the program I'm working on, the CRP, is in year 2 of 7 for probing out the challenges that even these programs are facing and how to advance a large movement forward that's based in reconciliation. So what I describe as the edges to grow that the CRP and myself and my own research are here to explore. Part of it I'd anchor in the concept, like I mentioned, that many Indigenous people's interest in environmental programs is based in their strong motivation to survive culturally. The gold standard for this would be the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll read quite a few text bits, but then move forward quickly without so much text. But Indigenous peoples have a right to own, develop, control, and use the lands and territories, including the total environment of the lands, air, waters, coastal seas, sea, ice, flora, and fauna, and other resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. This includes the right to the full recognition of their laws, traditions, and customs, land tenure systems, and institutions for the development and management of resources, and the right to effective measures by states to prevent any interference with, alienation of, or encroachment upon these rights. A fairly strong position, and one which most certainly caused the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia not to sign on to this right away, but doing so later with qualifiers. It was mainly an aspirational gesture. But before these countries did not sign the declaration, or UNDRIP, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they did sign, most of them, except for the United States, of course, and maybe Southern Sudan, I believe, that recognizing the close and traditional dependence of many Indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles and biological resources, and the desirability of sharing equitably benefits arising from the use of traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices relevant to the conservation of biological diversity and the sustainable use of its components. Also, quite strong position, but I'll point to you that it's contingent on the relevance of Indigenous peoples' practices and knowledge to the conservation of biological diversity. So this is the first point, I think, in the evolution of this global language in which the knowledge and the cultural survival of Indigenous peoples will be supported to the extent that it supports biological diversity, the conservation of biological diversity. So you see this instrumental role, which I'll show you that Canada grows out of later. The Aichi target, much later, developed in 2010, states something similarly, and I'll just point you to, again, the same language, that to the extent that it's relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, traditional knowledge and innovations and customary rights will be respected. But moving through this thicket, Canada in 2020, or has declared that by 2020, despite whether or not these practices and these states of governance support biological diversity conservation, customary use by Aboriginal Indigenous peoples of biodiversity resources is maintained compatible with their conservation and sustainable use. So you have this edge to grow, which is our tendency to prescribe an instrumental role to Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples' involvement in environmental conservation programs, which doesn't necessarily take at the same high value their aspirations and motivations and need to survive culturally. Some of these programs, which are in really being implemented extensively or across these same nations, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, there still are some wrinkles which are identified. In this quote from a study of Indigenous Guardians Program, an older woman is discussing the program with a younger male ranger. He says, if we don't burn, we won't get money for this fire project. And she says, you're worried about money, I'm worried for the country. So this speaks to some of the programmatic application challenges that are inherent to some of these really important programs. Similarly, the ICE report, or We Rise Together, the report by the Indigenous Circle of Experts, developed in order to show a path forward for achieving reconciliation through conservation, found the need to stake out a divergence between itself and the larger federal understanding of the IPCA program by saying we recommend that federal and provincial and territorial governments support IPCAs whether they count towards Target 1 or not. So what I'll say is that the work we're doing is to bring in the resources and thoughts and participatory methods needed to move forward and achieve all the goals we set forward and bring these values into conservation with each other because there's clearly compatibility. So I'll read this last piece of text and then it'll be a much more imagery based. But our framework and its purpose is based on a conviction that reconciliation requires deep acceptance between multiple value systems. We present a multiple value-based framework for envisioning and articulating compatibilities between global and local environmental conservation priorities and those of Indigenous peoples, cultural and material survival. Our explicit and unified goal, in the case of the KBA program in Mi'kmaq and other programs like it and other contexts like it, is to equally guide First Nations, First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, and other local stakeholder advocacy in the environmental conservation arena, channeling the full power of the biocultural perspective, including its demands for justice. The biocultural perspective is really where a lot of the work we're doing lies, specifically in an extensive literature review of the scholarship and the policy that implements many of the important ideas. I point you to the date of 1988 as one of the original moments where the biocultural perspective was born. Predates a number of these other larger global conservation and human rights declarations, but most certainly fed into them. And I point you to some of its evolution. Specifically, there are a number of things said in the document. For instance, inextricable link between cultural and biological diversity was a term used there, and in the document was used as a self-evident principle, but it has churned out a number of scholarly works that are looking at how to prove this, and especially how to illustrate it in the language of planners, so that biocultural diversity can be conserved along with biological diversity. However, some of this work overlooks the intensity of the recommendations for action from this same document. Thirdly, Indigenous specialists, it is demanded, should be recognized as authorities, as in highly influential and determinative in environmental policy in their traditional areas. Again, anchored deeply in the UNDRIP, or the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, although this predates it. And finally, they speak specifically to the need to acknowledge and compensate Native peoples for the utilization of their knowledge. So this is a very express point, which I believe is really essential to moving forward with the biocultural perspective. In our full literature review, we've shown that this broader perspective, used often without the term biocultural itself, is really characterized by three things: the full recognition of the self-determination of Indigenous peoples in matters pertaining to the environment, and another very interesting concept, the full recognition of cultural legacy of environmental quality in cultural landscapes. In landscapes of extensive habitation by humankind, there is it is essential to understand and to recognize and to support the legacy of environmental quality that it stems from centuries and millennia of environmental care and balance management systems. Finally, it is important to understand contemporary people as a necessary member of healthy cultural landscapes. And I'll go on to express how that will affect our work in Mi'kmaq. What's important to note, and I'll show you a video of Albert Marshall in his own words defining an essential concept actually originating in Mi'kmaq. This is Albert Marshall, who is of the Mi'kmaq people, but has now grown to become a globally resonant concept. In the Mi'kmaq, it's Etwaptamunk, and it means two-eyed seeing. Before I play his own speech, because the magic of his concepts is clearly in his word, I'll just say that in this clip, he is giving an expansive definition of two-eyed seeing, which goes way beyond knowledge transmission, and the equitable kind of consideration of knowledge and environmental decision making to speak to the urgency of action and the necessity of sustaining the multiple generations of Indigenous peoples around the world.
Jeff, I don't think we're getting audio for the video.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Thank you for telling me. I wonder if there's anything I can do about that. I could probably do.
There you go.
There is still no audio. Could we fix that, please?
Thanks for telling me, Kiara. Jamie, any advice? Or is it not possible and I can move on?
Well, we had audio for a moment.
Then it went. I can certainly paraphrase, and just with the caveat that it won't be of high quality as Albert Marshall's speaking. Similarly, I have some Roger Lewis segments in which he's speaking in his own words some of his core concepts, and I'll have to do my best at paraphrasing. I think.
Okay, why don't you try one more time? Make sure that the audio is set to not just pick up from your microphone, if possible.
Yeah, should be possible. Let's see. That in my share tray. Thanks for everyone's patience.
Perhaps when we share the recording of this video, we can provide links to these videos. Oh, yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure that that's going to work.
Okay. No worries. Pardon me, everyone. I can paraphrase, and I won't rush it. Say that Albert Marshall, in an excellent rhetoric, is saying the following: blue-eyed seeing is a rough translation of the Mi'kmaq term etwaptamo. And the reason it's rough is because, like I mentioned, in terms of knowledge transmission, this term goes beyond that and tries to really ensure the power and the responsibility of coexistence. It is a term which, in his words, he describes is deeply involved in concepts of relations with other species in terms of who is a citizen within Mi'kmaq culture and who is considered within larger Mi'kmaq decision making, but it also specifically speaks to the way forward for coexistence with settler and First Peoples. And for that purpose, he argues that unlike what we're looking at specifically today, this arena of environmental conservation, he sees it as applying very broadly to all aspects of human cultural life, from teaching to medicine to hospitality to making friendships and governance. And the two-eyed part comes from an attempt to translate the broader concept to a Western audience and to an audience that includes a lot of peoples around the world, but ultimately means it's a multi-perspectivism, but it's an acceptance of multiple perspectives, and it's an acceptance of the obligation to bring these multiple perspectives together and a concept in which it's an important way of life because it's so rewarding and so essential to human survival. So, what I can say is that from the biocultural perspective into our program, we attempt to capture some of this incredible mutualism and perfectly inspiring concepts of synthesis that Albert Marshall speaks to in his concepts of ethnobiology, or two-eyed seeing. But also, these are concepts which are firmly rooted, or at least firmly established, in the broader biocultural literature, which, like I say, I believe has many of its firmest footing in ethical prescriptions, as in what should be done in terms of how we might best perform environmental conservation as environmentalists, but also in recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples, and also in recognition of the essential role cultural survival plays in Indigenous self-identity. So from this, we build a larger model which we attempt to move forward, and Roger and I are hammering this out as with my work with University of Guelph and WCS Canada, including Chiara, who's here. But ultimately, we would like to envision an approach modeled on what can be described as natural grafting in nature. The agricultural version is, of course, a little less natural and a little less rooted in what you might describe as Mi'kmaq ways of life pre-contact, mainly because it's such an interventionist approach. But natural grafting occurs all over the place and is a well-observed phenomenon, and so can be understood as a union of specimens or a union of peoples, in the case of our approach, and a union of ways of protecting and caring for environment. And to take the analogy as deeply as possible, we look to the roots, which would necessarily be interacting extensively, sharing, and this is a really great emerging field of ecology, is all the interaction between specimens and species in forest context, but ultimately looking to our roots as European peoples and looking to the roots of Mi'kmaq peoples or Indigenous peoples anywhere, and looking for compatibilities within these traditions that may not be obvious at first sight. And then looking to the what's called the grafting union in the kind of arboriculture approach as requiring compatibility. The success of a grafting union depends on what is termed compatibility. And within the convergence of systems of environmental care, let's say between applied ecology and Indigenous knowledge of Mi'kmaq peoples, there would need to be compatibility to allow for shared new growth. As you see in this specimen of a grafted set of trees, they share an actual extensive branch or part of the crown that is as much part of each tree and only exists by the compatibility of the two. And within these two areas, from the crown to the roots, you have this necessity of trialing and working that is represented in this case by, you might describe as the vascular system of the trees. So working the wrinkles out of the system is an essential part. And here's how we describe it in a little more of a simplistic model. We have, in this case on the right, the Key Biodiversity Area priorities, or what are known as criteria, that are generally well-established ecological metrics that help us understand the role of diversity, or at least help us capture it and protect it most effectively. Those would be threatened biodiversity, threatened or rare species, geographically restricted species, and on a broad context of an area, you would have ecological integrity, and other important in the category D or criteria D, essential biological processes, including migration and other aspects of the life cycle that are place dependent. And finally, category E is one that I think translates extremely well, irreplaceability. This is in the KBA system, this is a quantitative metric, but I believe that there could be important work between this and, let's say, typical common Indigenous perspectives on the irreplaceability of ecological spaces and species. The term translation comes out of environmental sociology, and I won't delve too deeply into it, but ultimately there's a great piece that I would recommend everyone read called by Starr and Grissner, in which translation is pointed to as the major phenomenon that has kept the Berkeley Museum of Zoology in an effective system that has been able to move forward the priorities of numerous social groups, from those of donors to university deans to zoologists and zoology itself in terms of the study of zoology and let's say specifically the study of evolution, but also in many cases California Indians and a number of different trapping communities, or generally would be typically white communities, but those who participate and are able to achieve certain ends through their work with the Museum of Zoology. On the far left, you have what I would argue from the Biocultural Literature Review are the most pressing environmental priorities from the perspective of indigenous peoples. And this, like I'll show you, is present in the Mi'kmaq case, but this is a more general look at indigenous peoples worldwide. The first is rights to territory. And that feeds into the second, which I call folk value, which generally, it's a term I created, but it means roughly value to cultural survival. And in this case, the role of territory and the role of environmental balance in the survival of culture can't be underestimated and is a pressing immediate priority. Thirdly, concepts of citizenship and maintaining traditional views of citizenship is essential. For that, I'll pull out one of my favorite quotes. It's from Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs, who says that our births, lives, and deaths on this site have brought us into citizenship with the land. We participate in its renewal. We have responsibility for its continuation and grieve for its losses. It's a beautiful quote. It goes on, but it's an extensively deep look at how citizenship is a deep legal concept, a moral and ethical concept, and one in which plays a driving role in indigenous approaches to environmental care. And finally, the one that resonates most deeply in the context I hope to engage is legacy, the concept that peoples see themselves in their landscapes. And landscapes is a term I'll be calling into question a little bit later, but people see their own legacy in their environment. And in the case of KBAs, we'll see that it could be a very winning approach is to understand the role of traditional maintenance in Mi'kmaq in the persistence of biologically diverse and important biodiversity in Mi'kmaq today. So to back up just one stage, how to arrive at successful translations of priorities and values may need to dip into traditions. And like I say, seeking environmental compatibilities may require moving back into traditions and working together the pieces. I can't deny that my work with my older son on converting fractions to decimals and vice versa has certainly inspired this way to understand that you really can't move forward without successful translation and successful commensurate aspects to communicate with. And this all can be refined by trial, in which I hope to demonstrate a little bit is going on in Mi'kmaq. So to take a step back into traditions, I would recommend that it may be useful, especially when we move forward, and this has certainly propelled some of my discussions with Roger Lewis. Applied ecology may very well be, when we describe it to our children, why we do what we do, based in a sense of human rights and the dignity of people. And this is most certainly not an aspect of utilitarianism in typical economics. The founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, described human rights as nonsense on stilts. But still, human rights after World War II took off and has become a deep pillar of Western ethics, or at least on paper, and at least as much as we describe these things in our rhetoric. Secondly would be perhaps an ethic which motivates applied ecologists to get up in the morning, the obligation of good relations with nature. Thirdly, an obligation to protect. In the case of rare and endangered species, an obligation to protect the environmental balance as part of our obligation to maintain good relations with nature may very well be a very important motivating principle which has resonance in the indigenous perspectives. Finally, like I say, irreplaceability has a quantitative metric in the KBA tradition or the KBA program, but most certainly has ways to, we have ways to perceive it broadly and narrowly and understand the necessary role to protecting the irreplaceable is essential in both traditions. So this is the larger concept. Which brings me to the current proposed areas for KBA status in Mi'kmaq, specifically Nova Scotia is what we're looking at. Across a broader territory, we have 58 areas identified, in which 45 species are designated for protection and meet the criteria of being rare, endangered, and geographically restricted that make them candidates for protection. Again, these are rare and endangered species, and they also qualify as key life cycle areas. So we'll come back to this map in a second, but that's how it looks just at first glance. What we do find, though, after a desktop review is on a fairly limited sets of studies of significant species to Mi'kmaq way of life that come out of my tradition of ethnobiology, the practice of interviewing people and gaining lists out of them of important species. We don't have much overlap with the species that are designated for protection in Nova Scotia at the outset. In fact, there are three in common. There are the ash tree, which is endangered, the eel, which has very important parts of its life cycle in Nova Scotia, and the caribou, which as of currently is extremely rare in Nova Scotia province, more in Cape Breton as at present, and Newfoundland. But moving forward, none of the three have been captured in this specific set of emerging KBAs, and so that is something that's part of a negotiation at this stage, which represents an interesting way to leverage some advocacy. But this is where I've drawn my collaboration and conversations with Roger Lewis, who unfortunately won't be able to share his thoughts and concepts in his own words, but I'll paraphrase again like I did with Albert Marshall. He's had me think deeply upon the cultural memory in the English language, which really is present in the process of settling and establishing European-oriented livelihoods in the province of Nova Scotia, in the territory of Mi'kmaq people. And this is a really interesting map to look at when you think about Roger Lewis's perspectives, who has done extensive archaeology on river systems and fisheries in pre-contact contexts, specifically on fish weirs. And from the outset, one of the most interesting lines in his dissertation from my point of view is that one of the reasons he's one of the few archaeologists to really look at fish weirs seriously, not just specifically in Nova Scotia to be honest, is that these contexts have not attracted the attention of archaeologists. And so that's a really interesting concept in its own right. But when he looked at this map, he saw an extensive legacy of biological balance or ecological balance in what would tend to be backwaters, areas of wetlands, areas around lakes, and riverine systems. And one of the things he's, as I say, part of his paradigm shift, begun to look at is the resettlement of Mi'kmaq people both under British colonial administration and under Canadian policy to remove Mi'kmaq from their most essential places of livelihood, being the wetlands and waterways and what we might describe as backwaters from our linguistic tradition, and move them into upland areas where they could be more easily kind of monitored and regulated, especially some of their hunting and fishing activities, and where, of course, processes of major damming could proceed in Nova Scotia and such. But this is an essential view from him, and I'll kind of go into some of his context, and I'll show you what he describes in each of these slides. I'll try, Jamie, if you'll bear with me for just a second, try once again to get some audio and tell me if it happens.
Okay.
Very deliberate, very strategized.
Oh, I hear that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Plan.
Tell me right away when it doesn't work.
Now it seems to have gone out again.
Did it died out again, Jamie?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the difference is.
Me neither. I'll move forward.
Okay.
Roger Lewis is here describing one of his two major components based on his archaeological evidence and on his extensive study of Mi'kmaq language, Mi'kmaq environmental knowledge, which a lot of it is taking place in elderly care facilities in his, right now, his present day home of Halifax. But ultimately, he's going to describe in this video the absolute 12-month essential role of waterways for subsistence, from shellfish to eel, to salmon, to cod, to halibut, and on, even to porpoise. Now, what he describes is quite at odds he believes, with general principles that Mi'kmaq were entirely mobile. What he sees in the archaeological record, and based on some of his larger observations, is generally sedentary peoples gaining almost 12 months of subsistence from fisheries. And weirs is one of his key entry points. His dissertation is on fishing weirs in the archaeological record, like I say. But ultimately, piecing it all together, the Mi'kmaq way of life was deeply enmeshed with fisheries and what he calls an extensive island-wide fisheries management scheme. And he, of course, is incredible at the details, not just in geographical places across Nova Scotia, but in terms of styles of fishing weirs, and especially in terms of seasonality with various species. But he's pieced it together to his satisfaction that 12 months a year, Mi'kmaq could have been deriving especially important sustenance from fisheries and other shellfish. He goes on to describe that, of course, inland hunting would have been essential, beaver, moose, even caribou. And so was acquisition of fowl, which was also, in many cases, a water-dependent relationship. But what he goes to show is that the most intensive sites of Mi'kmaq livelihood, much of it months-long residences, as opposed to what you'd imagine as classic hunting and gathering being week by week. This would have been fisheries and not necessarily inland livelihoods. So I'll move, let's see. I can't move here. And in this case, I'll most certainly point everyone towards these videos which are publicly available. But in this case, I've decided to show a watershed map to go along with Roger Lewis's very extensive description in a CBC radio interview of his cultural landscapes theory of Mi'kmaq pre-contact identity. And what I'll show you now is this book is a project in which he was very involved with Bernie Lewis and Trudy Sable out of St. Mary's University. But ultimately, the language of this land, like I say, expresses not just his intense value for language in the cultural memory of Mi'kmaq people, but also his cultural landscapes theory, which he floats towards the end of the book, but ultimately is still in the business of processing and presenting to the public. But ultimately, in this CBC interview, he shows that the primary political units of Mi'kmaq would have been very, not strictly, but very correlated with watersheds. And like I described before, resources was one of the two main pillars of the purpose and practical reasons for this from an archaeological perspective. The other is mobility. And what he does with the CBC interviewer is walk through some of the watersheds of Canada and show how Mi'kmaq knowledge of watersheds, and specifically water divides in Nova Scotia, and specifically river systems, was an incredible environmental knowledge that propelled their mobility on the landscape. He describes certain canoe trips that could have been taken if taking advantage of tides in certain places and taking advantage of certain river systems with maybe one stopover in the inland lake. You could get from here to deep into New Brunswick in a period of 1 to 2 days. And he's really a master at walking through these various watersheds, many of which he canoes himself. But certainly, this is a resource that may be very interesting to the group. I'd be happy to check it out. But ultimately, it gives context to what may be very important divergence. Let's see if I can. There we go. It may be a very important point to stake out of divergence between European traditions in Nova Scotia, including that of applied ecology, and Mi'kmaq people's immediate environmental priorities. And one of the major acts of translation would then be understanding the essential role of waterways, wetlands, and river systems to Mi'kmaq sense of identity and to Mi'kmaq frameworks for environmental care. So once again, I'll walk through a translation as it might look if we're working specifically in Mi'kmaq with our present framework. Again, on the right side, we have a similar set of values that I've nominated based in the tradition of applied ecology, the deeper motivating ethics that drive our motivation to protect environment, to have good relations with it, and to intrinsically value complexity. So in the context of Mi'kmaq, there are very relevant concepts that I've listed here in Mi'kmaq language. I will not attempt to say them, but because I won't do a good job. But the first concept comes out of this language of the land volume out of St. Mary's University, and it means we sprout here. It would be an essential environmental value within Mi'kmaq peoples as identified through this work and identified through this work on the language and working through the ethnographic record. And we sprouted here, as Roger likes to point out, captures the idea of landscapes in a more full and rich way, because sprouting requires earth, requires oxygen, requires water, requires sun, and so much more than just land. And so bringing our European descended consciousness of environment out of the land is one of the most important goals. He believes that the way forward may be in Mi'kmaq language. But ultimately, protecting nature and keeping good relations with nature may focus specifically wider than species, and I think that KBA, as focusing on areas, and especially ecological integrity of areas, may have a very important opportunity to work on a broad sense within ecological areas that resonates with this Mi'kmaq concept. Wikawam is a concept that we might all know, but means home. It's most certainly a concept that would speak to the human rights aspects of Mi'kmaq, where applied ecologists may very well recognize first and foremost that Mi'kmaq belonging and authority in Mi'kmaq should be taken at face value and should be a self-evident principle. Kokmanak means relations, is a very common environmental framing across Indigenous North America. And in the case, like I mentioned, it would bring into concept citizenship, whereby we might understand the deep intercomplexity between species identified by the KBA process and the areas they live in and the interrelations between those species and species that the Mi'kmaq have depended on traditionally for their livelihoods and which they value today. The third concept comes to us from Unamai Institute of Natural Resources work that I'll be pointing to in just a sec. It means let's take care, a deep ethical principle which I think resonates deeply with our obligations of good relations with nature. The fourth concept down means using natural bounty. Using it is important, and not being used is important. So the process of using natural bounty, but also sustaining it. And finally, the concept of Kepmej, which UINR point out, UINR, Unamai Institute of Natural Resources, point at as an essential Mi'kmaq principle to take action towards preserving the Mi'kmaq way of life. Again, resonating with that human rights value. So promising frontiers, before I wrap up, our work hopes to really create important synergies with models like Pimachiawanaki, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated because and due to the cultural legacy of Indigenous peoples on that landscape. It's the first of its kind, and it's no surprise to me that it's occurring in Canada. Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership, I believe, by taking 7 years to work diligently and meaningfully with a large number of Indigenous leaders, it strikes me as an extremely meaningful approach, and especially in terms of its extensive time frame. Another thing I'll point to is UINR participatory management of Kluskap area as an IPCA, and I'll look at some of their materials just in a sec. Parks Canada is working in this very same area, and it looks like our program priorities will cross. KBA, based in Kejimkujik National Park, is territory in which they're looking at story mapping and will be implementing over the next few years or 18 months. And finally, the Mi'kmaq Place Names Project is an essential project where over 1,000 Mi'kmaq place names have been placed geographically in a mapping system. It is the work with Bernie, it's an output from the work with Bernie Francis and Trudy Sable at St. Mary's University, and it's one in which we're collaborating specifically through Roger Lewis. And finally, this is a really important outcome from a report by the Unamai Institute of Natural Resources, and one in which I hope to make sure that we find harmony with. But basically, these are priorities they have engaged and solicited from Indigenous leaders in Mi'kmaq for the Indigenous management plan of an IPCA of Glooscap's Cave in southeast Nova Scotia. So with that, I'll just leave it to questions, and thank you so much for all your time. Excuse the mishaps.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And yes, apologies for our technical difficulties. So we will open it up for questions now. We have about 10 minutes. We encourage you to please put any questions you have in the chat box, but I will also now unmute participants who would prefer to ask their questions verbally. Okay, so you should be able to unmute yourselves now or put your questions in the chat box. So I'll start with a question, Jeff. As somebody who's working on the KBA criteria and really focused on these quantitative metrics of ecological value, how can we move forward and do this work? How can we connect with communities and find these compatibilities?
It's a great question, very big question.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm focused on this art of translation, and where to seek resources on each side is essential. Right now, for instance, my strategy is looking for kind of the ethical underpinnings of applied ecology. And of course, the metrics and instruments and language of applied ecology happen to be, in most cases, based in mathematics. But it will be important to be able to tease those toward a central place or a middle space where the reason for the importance of the numbers can be very well understood in an Indigenous context. One of the most successful approaches right now that I'm seeing is understanding and really giving a deep thought to the environmental legacy of Indigenous peoples in places we would like to protect, in places that we see an applied ecological reason to get involved with. This is not so hard to do. As Roger Lewis saw very quickly, Mi'kmaq legacy of environmental care, he sees it as a living component of the KBAs we're seeing and determining in real time with ecological metrics and up-to-date methodologies of basically biostatistics. So he sees cultural legacy in those shapes, in those shape files. And so the cultural legacy and giving tribute to environmental care, which is millennia old and is now of global importance, is maybe a really important strategy and one that I think is right and meaningful. And
thank you. So I see one hand up from Morgan, but if you bear with me, Morgan, I'm going to ask one question from the chat first. This is from Dave Fraser. He asks, how important is it to find that key person to work with to make progress in this area? And what's your advice where that person in the local community is not there or not obvious?
Thanks, that's a great question. I would say, in my experience, identifying and being able to understand exactly in a translational sense, where is trust within communities? And this most certainly can manifest in leadership, but I've been in contexts where community leaders are not the most trusted individuals and are explicitly not trusted. So I'm not really speaking here about the Indigenous North American context. I'm speaking more of my work in Turkey and Azerbaijan, but ultimately how to understand and make trust in the community legible and work within what I call trust networks. So this could be a community leader. It might not be. It may be a leader who's not officially recognized, but is so clearly recognized within a community. And how important is it? I'd say it's very important, but there are very important methods to draw out perspectives and values from larger communities and not necessarily work just at the top of a hierarchy. For instance, working with women in Turkey, I learned incredible depth and almost encyclopedic depth of the cultural value of a particular species I was looking at that is rare and endangered. So ultimately that there are many approaches there, and very happy to follow up in follow-up emails if someone is very interested in that approach.
Great. Morgan, I see your hand up. If you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thanks. Thanks for an excellent talk. This was really exciting. I'm seeing also that someone raised kind of a similar question in the chat, but I was really struck by the Venn diagram that had the lack of overlap in terms of Mi'kmaq priorities and KBA kind of targets. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how those Mi'kmaq priorities were identified. Were they conservation priorities or cultural significance? Because I would imagine that if we asked about Mi'kmaq conservation, that would be something very different, right? They would. That's my hypothesis, at least.
That's a great question, and it is one of the most striking moments in my work on this project was the lack of overlap. From what I've been trained in the kind of biocultural diversity tradition, we would see tremendous overlap in the biological diversity that was especially important in a region, and the significance of that biodiversity by species to the culture, but that's not what we found. And so I've been thinking about the importance of bringing disciplinary adaptation to both sides, not just in the ecological sense, but also to the, like Morgan identified, these are ethnobotanical methods that were used. One of the important sources is the Unamai Institute of Natural Resources did put together a list of significant plants. Methodology from that report and the other one I was able to put together is a pretty standard list of important plants research. So you approach someone and you ask a list of important plants, and that's what you get. There are really important improvements and enhancements that can be made to that approach. And I would say some of them would be kind of broader semi-structured interviews where you may say, you may list and start with this, you may list the species that are important on a KBA site. In which case, for instance, a water pennywort was mentioned to Roger Lewis and he said, oh yeah, that's a good boat launching plant. So meaning it's not showing up on a cultural significance, maybe a more bare bones approach to interviewing people about important plants, but if probed a little deeper, if asked about landscapes, if asked to shift the frame of mind, especially to people who are actively using natural products, there may be a really important way to bring those circles of the Venn diagram closer together.
This is a related question from Kira, also saying because there are so few species overlaps between the KBA work and the Mi'kmaq priorities, will areas that have been identified as KBAs be of interest to Mi'kmaq-led conservation? And if so, how?
Great question. I think the work has to be done on site, to be perfectly honest. So I'm kind of forced into the position of a desktop review, kind of stuck on this side of the COVID curtain, and it's just not right and ethical to get out and work with Native peoples at this moment, of course, as everyone would probably agree. But from my understanding, the ethnobotanical tradition values immensely what's called a walk around or walk in the woods approach, where these sites must be visited with people, pictures, discussions around the site, discussions with people nearby, understanding the association and attachment of people to the specific place may bring out really important significance. And for it's so, I mean, to me, it's perfectly obvious. Every site that's designated as KBA in Mi'kmaq is most certainly of irreplaceable value to the people of Mi'kmaq. This is their traditional territory. As I've learned throughout a lot of research myself and around the world, indigenous peoples do not like to rank and prioritize one area or one species over another because of that concept of citizenship I spoke about. So on the ground work on these sites would be essential. I think the best case moving forward, what we're seeing is a lot of importance around the area of Kijimi National Park. So that would be, one of the first sites we could check out, but other sites it could turn out are really important as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. I think that is all the time we have for today, but we have recorded this presentation and we will make that available online along with the links for those videos that we were unable to watch. Thank you again, Jeff, so much for this really fascinating talk.
Thank you to everyone else as well. Appreciate your time.
We'll see everybody at the next one.